What the actual crap? Guys, what did you do? What did you do? We had so many dang Spider-Man reboots, and then Marvel steps up, reaches this deal with Sony so that they can finally get it right and say, hey, why don't we try something different? Why don't we try something unique and let it play in as one of the most famous Marvel characters to the rest of the universe? And they did it, and it was great, and so many people were happy. Disney was happy, Sony was happy because they were breaking records. Marvel was happy because they had Spider-Man part of their giant Avengers Marvel Cinematic Universe. Everybody was finally there, except for X-Men and Fantastic Four, but Spider-Man's far more popular than either of them. You finally had something good, and then somebody had to walk into the boardroom, okay? Somebody had to show up and say, you know what? How do we make this a lose-lose situation for everybody? Let's turn this beautiful thing we have going right now in this partnership and make it bad for Disney, make it bad for Sony, make it bad for Tom Holland, make it bad for Marvel, make it bad for the audiences, the fans, everyone watching this. How do we make it so, like, there's literally no benefit and there's no pro whatsoever? Well, that's what happened basically, because now Tom Holland's Spider-Man, the one that's been in the MCU for several movies now, is no longer part of the MCU, and there's all kinds of awkward to go along with it. Today's video is just ranting. Let's begin. So a lot of people are going to go ahead and blame one of the companies. It's either Sony's fault for not appeasing to Disney's demands, or it's Disney's fault for being more greedy. I'm here entering the room saying I don't care whose fault it was. Maybe Disney felt like they weren't getting a fair enough share of the box office success. And you can say like, well, Disney has enough money, but hey, they're the ones that are making Spider-Man break box office records. They're the one that's bringing a fresh and unique and new perspective to Spider-Man instead of just, Uncle Ben died again, responsibility. They tried to make it new with Spider-Man Homecoming and Far From Home, and making him a very, very close friend of Tony Stark. And that arc was so perfect, especially at the end of Avengers Endgame. And so much of the MCU has been deeply ingrained into Tom Holland's Spider-Man now that it is just going to be completely awkward and ridiculous for Sony to even somewhat attempt a Tom Holland Spider-Man without the MCU being referenced or addressed in any sort of way. For one, because of the cliffhanger ending of Far From Home, his secret identity is revealed to the world. That's kind of a big cliffhanger to end on, and made a lot of people go, wow, where are they gonna go with this next film? And I was actually very happy to see that they spoiled Spider-Man's secret identity at the end of the film, because you know what? We've had too many dang movies where he has to keep his identity a secret, and one thing I really enjoyed about Marvel's Cinematic Universe is they always kind of threw that out the window. Ever since the original Iron Man, it's always been like, you know what? No, secret identities are stupid. I'm Iron Man. I'm also Tony Stark. Deal with it. The fact that they were finally going to make a Spider-Man film where you could throw all that out the window and say, you know what if Peter Parker was just known to be Spider-Man? You could create so much more original screenplays and so much more interesting directions than likely what Sony is going to do. I know Sony has done some decent Spider-Man films. I really enjoyed Into the Spider-Verse, but the kind of reason that movie worked was partly because of the insanely good animation, but also because it was almost a parody of how many dang Spider-Man interpretations there are. They finally were just kind of embracing that and saying like, holy crap, there's so many different versions of Spider-Man, right? It's sort of insane. Here's a goofy one, here's a noir one. It was kind of mocking its own property. I mean, in that Into the Spider-Verse movie, they make fun of Spider-Man 3 directly, even though Sony is the company that allowed that to happen. Now, on the subject of whether or not it's Sony or Disney's fault, some people are saying Disney was being too greedy. Some people were saying Sony was not being reasonable. I say both of them screwed up because they had a contract, and how come as soon as you find a new agreement that you're not really happy with, and Disney wants 50%, or some articles were saying Disney wanted 30%, even though they were willing to pay for 30% of the budget, they just wanted 30% of the box office earnings as well. Okay, maybe Sony doesn't like that agreement. They say, no, we want to retain 95% of the box office. If you can't find a good agreement that you're both happy with, then default back to plan A. Don't just burn all the bridges, don't just destroy all the contracts. You had something good, you had something people were happy with. Even me, I'm not really that big of a Spider-Man fan. I find the Sam Raimi films laughable to the point of entertainment. I enjoy watching the Sam Raimi films, not because I think they're very good, but because they're so cheesy and hilarious that I actually end up laughing quite a bit at them. Andrew Garfield's Spider-Man, where I don't even want to think about them, but the Tom Holland ones were actually very decent, and the way they intergrained themselves into a bigger picture fits so well into the cinematic universe. Now that they've gotten to the point where it's like, we couldn't come to an agreement, so we're just gonna burn all bridges and decide Sony has all the rights again. Disney doesn't get to make any more in the MCU. Oh, God, why? Why was that the plan? Why were there not backups within these contracts that said, okay, if Disney wants more of the earnings and Sony doesn't want to give it to them, then just leave the contracts the same. Leave everything the same. Don't change anything. Okay, if you can't come to a new agreement, then you keep going in the direction you were going. Not just Disney going, hey, we'd like a little bit more money. Is that okay? And Sony says, nah, I think we want the money we have. Okay, instantly burn contract, tear the contract apart, take Spider-Man out of the MCU, and make it awkward for everybody. Do I even have to list the amount of things that are integral to the Tom Holland Spider-Man story that you're now suddenly going to have to magically throw out or somehow not address in future films? For one, the blip, an experience everyone in the Tom Holland Spider-Man films had to go through. Thanos snap and erasing half the population. Now in future Spider-Man films, they're just gonna have to pretend that never happened? They can't make references to that? They can't address that? They can't bring up the fact that half the population disappeared once? Now we're just gonna ignore that like, yeah, that was a weird Tuesday that lasted for 5 years. Also, Happy, who was kind of a mentor and coach to Tom Holland's Spider-Man, who's been in the Marvel Cinematic Universe since the first Iron Man. He was kind of coaching him in the last Spider-Man. He's a major part of the MCU. Now you just get rid of him and pretend he doesn't exist. Also, Aunt May, who is known for flirting with Iron Man, very much present in the last Spider-Man film and even dating Happy. She claims she wasn't, but there was definitely something going on. But either way, Aunt May was a big part of the last MCU film. His friends, MJ, how do you just ignore that? How do you just push that aside and say, well, we're just gonna put them in the new film and pretend the MCU never happened, or we're just going to take them out entirely? Far From Home ended in New York City, so are you gonna have him move at some point and everybody's recasted and you just don't address anything? There's literally no possible way that I can imagine that Spider-Man could move on into the Sonyverse and not be part of the MCU and things could feel natural and fluid and not awkward. Everything's going to be bizarre from here on out, especially given he had Edith glasses built by Iron Man himself. So much of the technology Spider-Man revolved around. His latest Spider-Man suit he got in Far From Home. That is directly thanks to Tony Stark's creation. How on earth do you just ignore that? This is going to be the bumpiest of transitions I've ever seen for a franchise, to the point that it might even just make more sense for Sony to reboot Spider-Man again, which is even dumber. I don't even know how to decide which decision is stupider for the character. Recast him again for like the 4th time in 2 decades, or just continue the Tom Holland Spider-Man in a completely different universe where basically nothing is the same except Tom Holland plays Spider-Man. Do you do another origin story? Because we're all kind of sick of those. The whole point of doing a sequel, Sony, the whole point of continuing a franchise is because we know what has happened to them in the past, and there's recurring characters that we have a history and relationship with. If you're throwing those things out, it doesn't really make sense to do a sequel or a continuation, because that's the whole point of having a franchise, is having characters that we learn with and grow with and experience crises together. Throwing all that out just defeats the entire purpose. It's just like Tom Holland is restarting as Spider-Man now at this point. There's no natural way they can do it, and I'm really hoping that before the next Spider-Man film, there's going to be some major Disney announcement, whether Disney is finally able to afford to buy off the rights from Sony and finally get Spider-Man back officially. But we know Sony is probably just as greedy, and they're not interested in selling Spider-Man because that's a cash cow for them. Or maybe Disney can afford to buy out Sony entirely. That would be pretty insane, but a lot of people have suggested it at this point. But my goodness, it just annoys me because there have been so many dang Spider-Man movies over the last 2 decades that Marvel stepping in and reaching this deal with Sony so that they could finally get Spider-Man into the MCU. This was supposed to be the last Spider-Man recast or reboot for a long time. They were like, let's get it right. That's why they casted someone so young, is because they knew they wanted him to play Spider-Man for many films down the road. Not just 2, not just 3. They were playing the long game, and in fact, Far From Home was hyping up the idea that he was kind of the new Iron Man. He was going to be the new central point of the MCU. Now taking him out of it, it ruins the MCU to a certain extent as well. Who's supposed to be the main protagonist of the cinematic universe now? Doctor Strange? Or Black Panther? Or Captain Marvel? God, please, no. He was such a well-known character, and he was such a well-known Marvel hero that it was going to make so much sense to keep him at the center of this new universe. And Tom Holland was so young and so ready to be a part of it, and he was so optimistic about it that it made perfect sense for him to be the new focal point, for him to be the center of this continued universe. He was gonna easily last another 10 years because of how young he was and how much growth that character could potentially go through. Now they threw all that out the window just because they couldn't reach an agreement they were happy with, and I'm sorry, that just makes no sense to me. If you can't reach a new agreement you like, then just go back to the last agreement. Why does plan B have to be burn all bridges and go AWOL and everyone tears up the contracts? It means everyone loses now, okay? Sony, your films aren't going to perform as well if they're not as part of the MCU. That is just factual. We've seen it before with Andrew Garfield. You don't really know how to do that many live-action Spider-Man films. Most of the time, they're quite cringy. I saw Venom. You can go back and watch my video on that. I didn't like it. I thought there were decent parts of it, but there was a lot of stupid parts of it. If you're gonna try to put Tom Holland and the Tom Hardy Venom in the same movie, it's just gonna be cringy and weird. It's not gonna fit together at all. So you're gonna lose people on this. You're gonna lose money on this. Far more than 5%. Probably lose more than 30% this time. If you're gonna continue Spider-Man films and not include them in part of the MCU, that's the reason Far From Home did so well, okay? It was because it came right off the success of Avengers Endgame and people wanted to see where the next chapter of the MCU went. The fact that they honored Iron Man's passing so much in that movie is what guaranteed a lot of box office sales in those theaters. Now that you're taking that away, people aren't really interested in the next chapter because you're basically starting fresh again. Even if it is the same actor, if he doesn't have those previous characters or those previous stories to fall back on and reference, then it's basically not even a sequel at this point. You're just retconning, and that's how you lose an audience quickly. So if you couldn't tell, I'm very upset by this decision, and I'm not even that big of a Spider-Man fan. So that should try to convey the message of how annoyed I am about this. I'm sure a lot of people out there are annoyed by it, but yeah, express your anger and your frustration by hitting me up over on Twitter or joining our Discord, and we can be angry about it there. Or maybe you think this is somehow a good thing for Spider-Man. You're one of those oddballs that says, no, Tom Holland MCU Spider-Man was weird and awful. I want another Spider-Man reboot, or I want a different Spider-Man that's different storyline without the same... Okay, we can argue later. Thank you guys for watching. I'll see you all in the next one. Take care.